Welcome to the Quincy Institute. My name is Kelley Vlahos. I am the editorial director of our magazine, Responsible Statecraft. I'm also a senior advisor on the think tank side. If you're not familiar with the Quincy Institute, we are an action tank committed to reimagining U.S. foreign policy as an instrument of realism and restraint, engagement and diplomacy, rather than power projection and military primacy. Our Global South program, which has brought this event together today, is helping to fashion a new bargain between the United States and the Global South countries, including the middle powers, to deepen ties and enhance U.S. influence in this vast region in less militarized ways, in part by bringing their voices and perspectives into Washington's policy-making spheres. Which brings us to our topic today. How can the U.S. build better relations and build better ties with the Pacific Islands? The 14 Blue Island countries, which include the U.S. territories of Guam, American Samoa, and the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, reflect a range of interests today, spanning climate change, defense, security, not to mention sovereignty and economic development. The U.S. has been a security guarantor of many of these islands, but with that has come trade-offs. And so what we're going to talk today about is those trade-offs and the possibility of improving the opportunities for stronger, more balanced relations between the Pacific Islands and the United States, particularly amid pressures of greater militarization due to great power conflict with China. So I'd like to introduce Mr. Robert Underwood first, whose think tank, new think tank, the new Pacific Center for Island Security, is what we're celebrating, the launch of which we are celebrating today. Yes. So I'm going to introduce him first. He's going to give some opening remarks, talk a little bit about your new organization, a little bit about your specific interests in Guam and U.S. and Guam relations, and then I'll introduce the rest of our panel, and they will be given some introductory remarks based on their own expertise, and then we'll get into some questions. And obviously, we'll be getting into some question and answer from the audience as well. So we'll leave enough time for that. So I'm going to turn it over to Robert now. Thank you, Robert.
Thank you.
Wait, no, stop.
Sure.
I am going to formally introduce Robert, okay? I got my notes here. Okay, so Dr. Robert Underwood is a former member of Congress and is President Emeritus of the University of Guam. He has a long record of educational leadership in Micronesia and is regarded as a leading authority on political status, indigenous issues, and sustainability in the Pacific. He was an active member of the Armed Services Committee and was appointed by 3 presidents to different councils and commissions. He was chair of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus and led national efforts to include Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in educational initiatives, including the establishment of a major scholarship program. So thank you. We're honored to have you here and to celebrate your new organization. And I turn it over to you.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate that very much. And I like that Quincy is trying to change the direction of foreign policy. We're just trying to get foreign policy to pay attention to us. That's a slightly different task. But and also, of course, I'm from Guam, and I'm an American. And so it's kind of like riding the rails of that, trying to figure out, whether you're domestic, whether you're not actually foreign, but more there's a kind of another category altogether, kind of called like non-domestic, maybe. I'm not sure how to characterize our political relationship. But I am very grateful for your attention. We did start the Pacific Center for Island Security about 1.5 years ago. And so this is our first event in Washington, D.C. And we're very grateful for Quincy to sponsor this. And we look forward to a collaborative relationship with them on key issues like climate change, as and I want to explain straight up that climate change is the major existential question for Pacific Islands on a long-term basis. But I think that Pacific Islands also need to pay attention and are being drawn into paying closer attention to the issues that are associated with geopolitical events, geostrategic competition in the region. And so our area of focus is naturally Guam and the islands primarily north of the equator. We think when people think the Pacific, they normally think Fiji and Papua New Guinea, perhaps Solomon Islands. But I always try to make the point that if there's going to be kinetic conflict, the conflict's going to occur in the North Pacific. It's not going to occur in the South Pacific. And so that means that there's a kind of a special sense of what needs to happen and how that needs to occur. Now, we are just a fledgling think tank. We are a 501c3, and we did get a major grant from Carnegie. So that allows us to do different things that we didn't used to do before. But we're grateful for that opportunity. I want to, in a way, I want to kind of characterize what we think the challenge is. And I have a whole speech set on this, but I think I'll just kind of talk to it a little bit because I think it makes it easier to comprehend. And I'll use, there's a couple of concepts that I'll use. One was given to me in an email by Chip Gregson. He said, he encourages to take a look at the islands as a kind of the flyover islands. And in a sense, when you think comparable to kind of the political sloganeering that you hear in the U.S., which is the flyover when people go from the East Coast to the West Coast, in a sense, people fly over these islands, but these islands are actually central to the glue, however you see it, to the strains, to the competition, to the solutions that are possible there in relationship to geostrategic challenges. Now, at the outset, I'll say it, and I want to make sure people don't misunderstand this. There is no hostility, or there's no open or even minimal hostility to the interests of the United States in any part of the in the territories or in Micronesia. That's pretty clear. There's no open allegiance or favoritism towards China. But having said that, that doesn't mean that just because someone shows up in uniform that you have to say yes to everything they say. And that's our challenge. And our challenge is that as a result of the geostrategic situation that we find ourselves in, the role of Guam and the role of the Micronesian region has changed dramatically and is of greater interest and of greater import. It used to be, for much of the Cold War, the concept of strategic denial and the concept of Guam as a kind of the tip of the spear. Guam was the place from which you could project power into all parts of Asia. And as long as they could do that and keep the rest of the region out of the hands of other people, strategic denial, then that was the basis for our existence. But now with the capacity to enter the area, now Guam is facing a different set of challenges. Some would say we're facing the challenge of potential attack. Some would say we're being groomed for attack. That actually the nature of the proposals for the increased militarization of Guam, which used to be just the amassing of offensive power, has now shifted in large part to the amassing of a defense in order to protect Guam and the military assets that it has. So that defensive system is most often associated with the enhanced integrated air missile defense system, which is being planned for Guam, which is this huge thing, which is sort of in my estimation, overpromises. We're supposed to be able to sleep at night because we're being protected 360 degrees. I'm not sure that that's even technologically feasible. And on the other hand, I don't know whether that really enhances stability. But that is being presented to us. So in addition to its offensive, so in the Cold War, you know, Guam could be used for real conflicts like Korean and Vietnam and not face any kind of consequence other than that. Now it's a slightly different situation. So in response to that, now the rest of the region is being drawn in as they do divert airfields, as they do divert and dispersal of assets planning. So now airfields are being built in Palau and Tinian. I have to correct my upbringing always tells me Tinian, but I always hear people say Tinian. So Tinian, and you have, of course, in addition to that, you have in Palau, and you have in Yap. So now that money's already been appropriated. So that is the problem that we are faced with. That's the conflict. That's the situation that we're faced with as an island society. So that has changed the whole dynamics of, I think, a lot of relationships. You know, it used to be that in Guam and in the surrounding region, the United States has a very clear face. It was sometimes a sympathetic bureaucrat. Sometimes it was somebody was coming in and was performing some, you know, kind of domestic role. You had Peace Corps volunteers. You had all of these individuals coming up. Sometimes you had migrants, American migrants who settled there, and you know, because they're looking for a certain life. But today, the face of the United States is almost entirely military. And so that takes on a whole kind of different characteristic. And so to what extent can you ameliorate, change direction, or say no to anything that is advanced? It's very difficult in this situation. The freely associated states of the FSM and the Marshall Islands, and their two ambassadors are here today, and I thank them for their appearance here, Ambassador Paul and Ambassador Jackson. So I thank them for their attendance here today. The territories, of course, are in not that role. You can't say no. I mean, you can, I guess you can complain, but you can't really say no. And of course, they are unincorporated territories, which means they have less political agency within the American system. They're not a state with 2 senators or a voting representative in Congress. And if anybody knows what it's like to be a non-voting representative in Congress, it's me. And so it's like trying to pass legislation with one hand tied behind your back, you know. And so it's a difficult, not an untenable, but it's a difficult situation. So in the midst of all that, and in the midst of the value of Guam, and the value of Guam is enormous, you know. It has the largest fuel capacity and weapons capacity for the Air Force. It has additional, the first Marine Corps base, I think since the 50s, has been established there. And I say that as a proud grandson of a Marine. One of the first Marines to ever come to Guam is named Underwood, and that's why I have this name. So but it's the first Marine Corps base to be established. Submarines are there. And so you have all that additional offensive capacity, but now you have these defensive arrangements. And so now how do you deal with that when you are a political entity like an unincorporated territory? So at one level, I like to think, well, there may be other unincorporated territories joining us soon. Maybe Greenland, I don't know. Maybe the scope of unincorporated territories will be expanded. And so as I think of, you know, as I think of President Trump's attention, he seems to be focused on G, you know. There's Greenland, there's Guantanamo, there's Guatemala, there's, you know, Gaza. maybe Guam is next. Guam is next. So we're waiting to actually see what the discussions might be with the Japanese Prime Minister, because the Japanese Prime Minister has indicated that it might not be a bad idea to put some Japanese self-defense forces in Guam. And that sort of sends another jolt, because whether that's going to happen or not, what it does indicate is that when you're in Guam, you have no capacity to interact or interface with that possibility. That's the lesson. So how do you deal with that? Well, I would like to think that the solution is a really powerful think tank. But it isn't. I think all think tank people know that. That's you know, of course you can contribute to that. So that's our function. So our function is to try to create a basis for independent, island-centric thinking, admittedly island-centric thinking. You know, we're not naive in this. We know the challenges. We know what we're up against. And we know the value of of the American military. We know that they you know, I respect very much their mission. But the point is really, at the end of the day, why, I always tell people I respect the fact that the military is supposed to envision the worst case scenario and protect us from that. But why do I have to live the worst case scenario? That's the question. And under what is everyone living the worst case scenario? Or why am I being selected to live this worst case scenario? Why is that happening to me? And are there ways that I can deal with that? And so in partnership with many island communities, we have envisioned this Pacific Center for Island Security. We're doing an interactive mapping exercise in which we're going to attempt to gather information on all military movements, all diplomatic initiatives, and you know, economic initiatives that are in the region, so people can see them and understand them, and they can point to it, and they can see the connections. And then we're also forming a Micronesian security group where we're seeking representatives from each jurisdiction that would join us in doing some analysis of the situation in their particular island group. So that's who we are, and we think we're off to an okay start. Now we're off to a better start. I just wish we had, you know, Guam weather here. So other than that, I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Well, it sounds like you have a lot of work to do, but the interactive nature, pulling all those resources together is just going to be fundamentally a fantastic tool for journalists, for experts, for lawmakers, policymakers. If you can pull all of that together, I mean, I think that's, and it doesn't sound like it's been done before, and harnessing all of the energy of all the islands and mapping out the military distribution, the assets that are in the region. I don't know if anybody's done that before.
Well, maybe somebody in the Pentagon's doing it. I'm
It's in a drawer somewhere.
Somebody's doing it somewhere. But our purpose is not, you know, when we, and for the past year and a half, we've been very busy and pointing out different things. And, you know, sometimes local elected officials will come to us and say, wow, where did you get that information? And I say, it's called Google, you know. It's not like, it takes a little hard work, but it takes a little, you know, detective kind of skills. But basically, of course, we're dealing with all open source material. So, you know, so that's basically who we are. But there's enough open source material to open up minds. See, only closed minds need closed materials. Open minds need open source material.
I like that. Okay, so I am going to introduce the rest of our panelists, and I have a zillion questions for you, and we have a short period of time. So I'm going to introduce, and then each of them, like I said, will be providing their own remarks. Dr. Laura Grego is a senior scientist and the research director of the Global Security Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists, where she has worked at the intersection of science and public policy, in particular nuclear weapons, missile defense, and space security issues for 20 years. She recently completed a Stanton Nuclear Security Fellowship at the Laboratory for Nuclear Security and Policy at MIT. Before joining UCS, Dr. Grego was a postdoctoral researcher at the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics. Very impressive. And then we have Leland Bettis, who is the co-founder of the New Pacific Center for Island Security and a long-term resident of Guam. He has held responsible positions with the government of Guam as executive director of the Commission on Self-Determination, advisor to members of the Guam legislature, and worked with 2 gubernatorial administrators. Mr. Bettis worked in governmental and intergovernmental affairs, including over 2 decades of representation and negotiation work involving U.S. agencies, including DOD, Justice, and Interior, as well as the U.S. Congress. His role in public policy includes over a decade of work at the United Nations and regional organizations. So welcome. And my colleague, last but not least, Sarang Shidore, is the director of our Global South program at the Quincy Institute and a senior non-resident fellow at the Council on Strategic Risks. He has also recently taught the geopolitics of climate change as an adjunct professor at George Washington University. Sarang has more than 125 publications to his credit in journals, edited volumes, and media outlets, including the New York Times, Foreign Policy, The Nation, and South China Morning Post. Prior to his current role, Sarang was senior research scholar at the University of Texas at Austin and senior global analyst at the geopolitical risk firm Stratfor Inc. And thank you, Sarang, for pulling this event together on behalf of your program and Quincy. This is amazing, an amazing turnout, by the way. So let's start with Laura. I want to and then we'll get to questions after we all finish.
And I am on.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation to be here. Thank you, everyone, for taking your time to talk about these things. And I'm sorry that I have to go after Robert. Somebody has to, but it's never a good slot.
As long as you don't have to go. I got a little nervous there. I thought you were going to leave.
No.
I have a lot of questions for you.
I've really enjoyed having collaborated with Leland and Robert and Ken at PCIS over the last year. And I'm a technical, researcher in missile defense, and that's really where I've, the types of engagements we've been talking about in the questions, and I think you really teed me off, Robert, with these new developments and these questions around the offensive and defensive and strategic focus of Guam. As you mentioned, it's always been a strategic location, but it has increasingly become a focus of Pentagon plans as the U.S. shifts its attention more closely to China and North Korea, and to some degree, Russia in the Pacific. In fact, in May 2022, the Navy Admiral John C. Aquilino, the commander of Indo-PACOM, testified that Guam's strategic importance is difficult to overstate. That's a lot of attention. And in the National Defense Strategy and the Missile Defense Review stated that Guam is home to key regional power projection platforms and logistical nodes, and is an essential operating base for U.S. efforts to maintain a free and open Indo-Pacific region. Another analyst put more of a fine point on it and said, Guam would be the gas station, repair shop, and command center for U.S. naval and air forces during a confrontation with the Chinese People's Liberation Army. So that's a lot of attention on an island that's 50 kilometers long. It's a big job. So as the strategic focus is becoming stronger, of course, Guam hosts Anderson Air Force Base, the airfields and fuel storage facilities that support U.S. bomber aircraft and tanker aircraft to refuel the combat aircraft operating over the Western Pacific. U.S. submarines, as you mentioned, Robert, operating from Guam could be important for countering Chinese surface fleets and looking for anti-submarine warfare. There are space surveillance and communications infrastructure, so there's a lot in a small area. And additionally, I think as you briefly mentioned, as the U.S.-Japan alliance moves forward with the Defense Policy Review Initiative, there are a large number of Marines shifting from Okinawa over to Guam. So there's been an increasing focus on how to defend those assets in times of crisis. And so I think that's where I came in our discussions, is making sense of some of these plans, which I think on the face of it look fairly overwhelming and fairly detailed, because I actually have never seen such a complex and maybe overwrought defensive system as the plan is, as you mentioned, for Guam. And to try to think through, from an island perspective, those who will be living there, how do you make sense of the costs and benefits of a system like that? And I think Leland will really talk to us in detail about the costs to not just economic, but those who live there. And I think it helps to get a sense of the benefits. What would this bring to the people there? What are the promises of a missile defense system? Holding a lot. So the integrated air and missile defense system, it has been in the works for some years. Some of the elements are already there. The Army deployed a THAAD battery to Guam in 2013. THAAD is a missile defense system designed for shooting down short, medium, and intermediate range ballistic missiles. And those are meant to be intercepted in their final phase of flight, just as they're reaching their targets. So rather than covering a large, they're not designed to cover a large geographic area, but a smaller one, which suits Guam pretty well. And the U.S. Navy has provided additional missile defense capability for Guam on an as-needed basis by shifting some of its Aegis ships equipped with missile defense system nearby. And those are meant to defend against longer-range threats during their mid-course or terminal phases. And currently, those systems are not integrated. They're both just Army and Navy visitors. But in October 2022, this was the big announcement when the U.S. Missile Defense Agency said that INDOPACOM has issued new requirements to upgrade Guam's missile defenses. And this was going to be new. It's meant to include 360-degree coverage and to have layered defense against regional ballistic, maneuvering ballistic, hypersonic glide, and cruise missile threats. So 360 degrees against all kinds of missiles you can conceive of. It's a big job. And you could say, it remains to be seen how that's going to play out. As a longtime observer of missile defense systems, as I mentioned, I haven't seen something quite so complex being attempted. That's a lot of things to get moving at the same time. And in any realistic scenario, you wouldn't have one thing at one time from one direction. You'd have all sorts of things coming from different directions of all sorts of types. So it's a complex system. And the plans as they've unrolled, have included mobile missile defense systems, disaggregating radars from their interceptors, taking up a lot of space. There will be estimated, I think, 20 ground sites dispersed across the island, including radar, sensors, missile launches, missile interceptors. I think it would be the most complex missile defense system that's ever been built, and is hugely ambitious. So will it work? Well, it's hard to know. You can make an assessment of each different system to say how well has it worked in the past, how well has it been used in battle. Most systems that are longer range have never been used in battle or only very seldom, so you kind of have to rely on the testing programs. I'll say more about that in a moment, but a question you might want to ask is the concept make sense? Does a concept, what do we know about what the plans are and would do what it was meant to do. In the fiscal year 23 National Defense Authorization Act, Congress wanted an answer to that question. And they directed the Department of Defense to contract with a federally funded research and development center, in this case, Lincoln Labs, based out of MIT, to conduct an independent assessment of the proposed architecture and to look at the military personnel and the infrastructure needed to make this happen. Although the study was completed, I think it was completed earlier last year, if I'm right, the results have not been, earlier last year, May 2024, have not been offered in an unclassified version. So the residents of Guam don't actually know what those results were. I would say that's an urgent need for people to understand the cost benefits. So I guess the question is, what do we know about the testing system? Having been a longtime observer of missile defenses, testing has always been a challenge to do with fidelity to operationally realistic conditions. Like, will it work in a real world situation is often a different question than does it work in a very scripted type of optimally organized system. And for the most part, many of the systems have taken a long time to get anywhere near the sort of operational tests. So I think that does remain to be seen. And so I think, so that the final thing is, and I'm going to pick up on something that Robert said, the way it's being framed for the people of Guam is that you should be able to sleep well at night. That's what we're protecting you. And I think it's been being framed as a full protection, but I think the way it's following the language that most missile defense systems have in the end followed, where what you want to hear is, yes, I'm protected against all threats, 360 degrees. But when you look into the details, really what it's being promised is more like defense against some things to some degree of some number. And it's important for the people of Guam to be able to ask to what degree, to what number, and what should I expect for all the disruption to our lives, and to actually be able to get answers to those questions, which should have answers. And given how small the island is and the likely inventory of the adversaries, it's most likely meant to forestall a complete, keeping Guam out of the picture for some amount of time while the U.S. military does its own activities. Yeah. So I think those are really key questions, and I'm actually really happy to see you all here in Washington, D.C., where you should be able to get some answers. So to the degree I can help, I'd be happy to do it.
All right. Thank you.
Laura. Thank you, Lori. Leland? I'll let you key in your password and. I think it goes on automatically.
Yes, thank you very much for the invitation to be here. So the question, how can the U.S. build better ties with this big island, begs an honest level set about where we are today. So as we think about the layers, or the levels of national power in the competition that defines our age, we're obviously living in very exciting times. Over the past 2 weeks, we have seen strong signals from the new U.S. administration that soft power is out and hard power is in. Even the softest elements of diplomacy, information, economic power have taken a decidedly hard edge. In the Asia-Pacific region, however, it has long been clear for some time that U.S. strategy in relation to China is to use all the levers of national power. How effective these levers have been used, both separately and in conjunction with each other, is open for debate. But the momentum to deploy them has been increasingly frenetic, reflexive, and nationalistic in response to China's use of its national power. Guam, being closer to China than the nearest U.S. state, is hypersensitive to U.S.-China relations. From the U.S. vantage point, the national power lever of Guam seems to be strictly military. The U.S. occupation of Guam since 1898, and at every significant event in the region subsequently, at least from the U.S. vantage, Guam's value and utility has been defined in military terms. As others have alluded here, the face of America in Micronesia wears a uniform. In the current competition environment, the U.S. Department of Defense views Guam as a whole in terms of its military value and the island's capacity for and in conflict. The 2024 Guam DoD Master Plan, Gap Analysis, and Execution Plan notes, and I quote, DoD aims to develop a comprehensive master plan for the island of Guam, which will encompass civilian lands, infrastructure, and assets alongside DoD installation. It's not without reason, then, that in DoD circles, Guam is known as the tip of the spear, or the forward edge of the Indo-Pacific. And while the whole of Guam is increasingly enveloped in DoD's warfighting plans, how the civilian community is being prepared for anticipated conflict remains an undefined, unfunded, and open question. As the capacity of Guam is assumed to be fully an instrument of U.S. military power, the subordinate relegation of the people of the island gives us a unique perspective on the credibility of military power. And let me use an analogy I'm going to talk about a little bit. From Washington, we see issues perhaps in Guam through the lens of a telescope. In Guam, we see them under a microscope. We normally think about this competition being played out primarily in foreign affairs and defense centers like Washington, D.C. and Beijing. But it is also possible that the claims of great powers are often best tested in their most remote locations. Today, most of these remote outposts are islands in the Guam cluster. Now, there's plenty of room for discussion about how real, threatening, or proximate a threat of war with the PRC is. But in Guam today, the U.S. is sharpening the spear in preparation for conflict. Today, and this has real society-wide implications for us. Moreover, we can see up close the operational concepts and tools the U.S. military is using in Guam and the region to respond to competition with China. This gives us a unique perspective on how military power might work in conflict and what conflict would look like for us. And I'll be happy at some point this evening in our discussions to discuss any discrete implications for both Guam and the region and the larger U.S. community. But simply put, the military operates with a free hand in Guam and the region in ways that likely overstate military effectiveness and understate the impact on local communities. First, the military operates as the principal face of all U.S. national power throughout the region. Military interest drives U.S. policy. Military activities are the most significant U.S. national presence and shapes diplomatic, economic, and information aspects of U.S. policy. Although we live in a more nuanced world than at the end of World War II, one can clearly hear the strains of an early commander of Naval Force Marianas. Quote, "The economic development and administration of relatively few native inhabitants should be subordinate for the real purposes for which these islands are held," end quote. I should also say it's unmistakable that this U.S. primary interest in the region reflects a significant ability to generate force projection, but principally from the infrastructure that's in Guam. So this would kind of be the view of Guam and the Micronesian region through the telescope. Our view at the microscope is a bit different. The political cost for the U.S. military to implement its objectives in the region is low, even if, to us, the economic, social, cultural, and ecological costs are high. The military works to implement its preferences with minimal local input into the decisions. There's an expectation of our acceptance, a view toward military expedience, prerogatives, and even accommodating inter-service rivalries and skirmishes is at the expense of the community's best interest. Sloganeering dominates military-led campaigns. We are told, quote, "Presence is deterrence, even when it is obvious that presence is what makes us targets, and proposed systems like missile defense will likely increase the number of targets. We've been told we don't need civilian shelters because we have a missile defense system, even when the U.S. military works with allies like Japan to coordinate shelter preparations and even evacuations for up to 120,000 Japanese citizens from islands that are also likely to be subject of attack and conflict. We are told the proposed integrated air and missile defense system will, quote, defend the entirety of Guam, even when the U.S. government is funding and building divert fields around the Guam cluster in the event that Guam airfields are not available. We're told that it will defend the entirety of Guam, even when the Missile Defense Agency itself has noted that the system is intended only to deter a small coercive strike. We're supposed to accept that pre-planned and staged missile test flights that integrate some new or existing radars is somehow, quote, a critical milestone in the defense of Guam and the region, end quote. But, we all know that what you do at a shooting range with flight tests is not the same as what happens in real life. Ultimately, all the cheerleading for the new system support implementing military activities that have an impact on our lives, even if the conflict never occurs. These are increasingly implemented without a sense of efficiency or appreciation of Guam's interest, and the recent discussions about what type of missile defense system would be deployed in Guam, whether it's Aegis offshore, Aegis onshore, or the proposed system that the Army is putting together, is massively different in terms of the effect that it has in Guam. So even if the worst case were to occur, the current plans for Guam do not incorporate the kinds of basic civilian security measures, shelters, and food security that we see in Japan, Korea, and Taiwan. I don't want to discount the many sources and voices of concern about the military role today, ranging from whether the military has sufficient equipment or even the right strategy, to views about it being driven, even captive, to a smaller and smaller set of enriched corporate providers. But these views generally do not trickle down to consideration about what it means for civilians who would be on the front line of conflict. These sorts of views are from the telescope. I would add that by and large, most mainstream media and other outside observers tend to go along with the military storyline about the military's role in the region with no real sense of the Guam community. For those of you that have clear-eyed views about the challenges the U.S. military faces in confrontation, it might surprise you that the real concerns do not make it into the discourse on the front lines in Guam. On the front lines in Guam, it's cheerleading and sloganeering. By way of example, in the past month, Hudson and Stimson have both put out important work on the vulnerability of U.S. air bases throughout the region. In contrast, the U.S. Air Force General in charge of Andersen Air Force Base, Guam, was recently quoted as saying that Guam could, quote, sleep well at night. You're going to be fine, end quote. And that, quote, Andersen Air Force Base is on the watch, and we got this. From where we are then, there's a massive gap between military claims and credibility. Perhaps this is not something of concern to those people looking through the ends of a telescope. But on the front line of potential conflict, which everyone seems to be preparing for, the absence of candor about the risk faced by the community is anything but reassuring. The failure to account for civilian protections in the event of conflict deeply discounts military claims about providing security for the whole of Guam. And let me leave you with a final thought about why what is happening in Guam might be important to you. Over the past year, there's been increased official and Pentagon-funded studies that raise the prospect of limited nuclear war in a regional conflict with the PRC. Remote island locations, and Guam specifically, are identified as likely PRC nuclear strike or counterstrike targets. In this regard, the fate of the pond might be the canary in the coal mine for U.S. extended deterrence credibility across Asia, as well as a feedstock for global nuclear escalation. If the pond's predicament is the bleeding edge of a new nuclear age, it is time to reconsider the premises strategy that militarizes and weaponizes competition with China. Managing escalation once a nuclear play has been executed will be new territory in a conflict between nuclear powers. You can feel this angst in all the effort over the past year that is being put into official and expert consideration of quote-unquote escalation management. The Department of Defense's DIA is clear in its warning about nuclear operating environments that become complex. Quote, the possibility of pathways for conflict escalation may not be well understood or easy to predict, end quote. Perhaps limited nuclear war could end at Guam, could be managed. But if it goes beyond that, no one wins a zero-sum game with nuclear weapons. I understand that the perspective at the microscope is much different than that of the telescope. But our experiences are less insular, more global than the power centers where ideology, groupthink, doctrine, and policy too often lead to insensitivity about decisions on the periphery. From our proximity and intersection, we can see substantial issues when it comes to strategic competition and geopolitical posturing. We believe that understanding what occurs in Guam and the Micronesian region can help inform the larger view of the strategic environment. Thank you.
Thank you, Leland. Sarang?
Thanks, Kelley, and it's lovely to be here with Robert, who we met first, about a year and a half back over a lunch in Open City in Woodley Park and talked about Guam. And I learned 90% of what I know about Guam from him. So, and there's a lot more to learn, of course. But so glad to be here sharing this, our very first event on the Pacific Islands in the Global South program at the Quincy Institute generally. And so proud that Robert and Leland have their new think tank, which will bring us to all of us in Washington, I think, to a different level of understanding of this region, and particularly Guam. I'm going to take the role of widening the aperture of this thing beyond Guam to sort of straddle the whole of the Global South just for a second and then zoom in a bit on the Pacific. By that I mean a whole region from stretching from Peru to the Pacific, which used to be called the developing world, but is now called the Global South. It's a region that often gets looked over or becomes a flyover region, in a sense, when we talk of the great power competition or even economic questions. Historically, that's been the case. But increasingly, we realize that that is no longer tenable, that this vast belt that circumnavigates the globe is actually quite important in the way we Americans, or we who live in the United States, live and prosper. And so the key thing to understand really about these states that are sort of in the vast middle, if you will, one is that all of them seek to catch up with the wealthy world. It's a very fundamental drive in a way that's different from when politicians in the US or Germany talk about the economy. When politicians in the Global South talk about the economy, it's about closing a very large gap, or at least a fairly substantial gap, with Europe, Japan, and the United States. So that's a very important driver that drives so much of their grand strategy. And the second aspect of this vast region, and this extends to the Pacific as well, although with some qualifications, is their basic impulse is non-alignment. The basic impulse is not to take sides in the great power competition or any competition of that scale. And the reason is very simple. It's not a moral reason. It's a reason based on strategic interests. They want to maximize benefits for themselves. And they feel and they believe that they can leverage all sides in this great power competition to benefit their own economies and their own rise. So in other words, leverage all great powers for their own benefit and not be locked into only one relationship. And both of those things are actually in evidence in the Pacific. Maybe the second one a little bit less because, of course, Guam is a part of the United States, but there are also other states with special relationships with great powers. But nevertheless, the impulse is there. For the United States, of course, the Pacific is a very special place. You can arguably, and there's been books written on this, that it's really the last stage of manifest destiny. It's the last stage of sort of the westward ho impulse that that took the U.S. All the way to California, and then arguably the Philippines was acquired, and Guam and some other territories in the same sort of an impulse. Of course, we have some decades away from that. Times have changed in some key ways. But one thing was quite clear after World War II for some decades, is that the United States dominated the Pacific through the Cold War in ways that it probably did not dominate any other region. I mean, even the Caribbean, you had Cuba. So the Pacific was sort of an American lake, vast as it is. I mean, if you look at the Earth's map, right, it covers the entire, you can center the Pacific and you won't see land almost on either end. And so it's a pretty large space, maritime space, that was sort of an American-dominated space. But that has changed, right? So that has changed a little bit in the last 10, 15 years or so. And that's because we are seeing a decline of unipolarity. You're seeing a rise of China. You're seeing also the rise of middle powers. It's not just China. It's other middle powers like Japan and Australia, and to some extent, India and Indonesia, who are starting to make their presence felt independently. In some cases, in some of the actions are coordinated with the US, but their interests are also their own interests. So you're seeing the beginnings, it's not there yet, but the beginnings of a multipolar Pacific. Maybe that'll happen 1 or 2 decades from now. We don't know. So what does that mean for the US, and what does that mean for Washington and our think tanks? I think that the great power competition is here to stay. I don't think we can abolish it. I don't think we can say there will be no competition and there will be kumbaya between the US, China, and Russia. But what we can aspire for is a different kind of a competition. Not a militarized competition, not a forward edge competition, not one that militarizes the islands or indeed any parts of the world in these excessive ways that may be happening, but in a way that is much more managed and stays in spheres such as economics and other spaces. And is that achievable? I think that is achievable. I think we can move the competition away from where it's going at the moment, but it's a tension that we have to navigate as the US, and of course the think tanks have a major role in it. Talking of threats, I cannot not speak about climate change, because Robert mentioned that in a slightly longer time frame, climate change is an existential threat. I mean, we use the word existential all the time nowadays. These words are overused. But in the Pacific, it's truly existential, because you can't tell somebody to go back where they came from if the back doesn't exist anymore. And some of these island states looks like will either partially or fully disappear by the end of the century. And we are talking of there being just not inhabitable spaces for people to live properly. So for the Pacific Islands, which have contributed only 0.035% to the total emission stock in the environment, and will pay potentially the cost of their very existence. I mean, think of the ratio of responsibility to cost. They have a very low responsibility and the highest cost you can imagine. It's probably the highest ratio in the world. And so this is a true emergency. And that's why the Pacific Islands want the world to take it on as a security issue. And they've been pushing that in the United Nations. There are two sides to that question. But nevertheless, their demand is very logical. And they're also facing not just sea level rise, but they're also facing things like increased and stronger typhoons, natural disasters. Some of them are in deep debt. When disasters strike, they still have to pay their debts, and that gets harder. So all of this adds to a substantial national security question for the Pacific Islands, but for the United States, because for Guam and for the Federated States of Micronesia, for Palau, for Marshall Islands, who are associated with the US, this is existential, and so it should be taken seriously here in the US, when we here ourselves have faced, in some parts, existential crises like the LA wildfires recently. So I'm going to stop there and then hand it back to Kelley.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So I think I'm going to tee off this issue of climate change and ask Dr. Underwood, Laura, Leland, have there been efforts by the U.S. military to respond to some of the demands that Sarang had highlighted by the people to initiate some, not just prevention or mitigation, but some security measures for the increasing climate security issue? Are they responsive? And all of the billions of dollars they're putting into missile defense and other hard security measures, are they doing anything to respond to the climate security issue?
Climate change has become a political slogan here. Accepting it or rejecting it is kind of a political issue inside the United States, and it shouldn't be. So, unfortunately, that means that the military then has to respond to whoever's politically in charge. So to the extent that there were people saying that climate change is real, and that was the political establishment in Washington, D.C., then the military went along and said climate change is real. Whether they're actually doing anything about it is sort of open to question. In some areas, like in Kwajalein, they're going to have to do something about it because it's the self-protection of their own military facility as well as the inhabitants, as well as the original inhabitants of Kwajalein. So in some areas, there's a great deal of attention to it. I suspect that there'll be less attention to it in the coming years. But the characterization of, and I'm glad Sarang brought this up, of climate change as an existential threat is a very real one, but it also, in my opinion, takes away attention from more immediate things, not by outside powers, but by Pacific nations themselves. Frequently, they want to pretend like these things, other things don't really matter. So, you know, the big threat is climate change, and so they pay a lot of attention to that. And in some presentations I've made, I've sort of tried to make the case, you know, I tried to make the case in front of the South Pacific Parliamentary Group last year that I understand that and I accept that, but you have to pay attention to this arena, because this arena is going to shape your economic chances. It's going to, it's crucial. And so it's not to put climate change in the back burner, but the U.S. military as an institution, if you can call it that, in terms of its relationship to climate change, is going to pretty much follow whatever the national policy is coming out of Washington.
Can I just do a two quick finger? I agree with Robert that there can be an immediate threat tomorrow that overwhelms everything else. But there's a very interesting marriage happening between the great power competition and the climate question. I think many of you might have read about the agreement between Australia and Tuvalu. That was also extended to Nauru in a different sense. But with Tuvalu, the agreement was really predicated on climate migration, right? And the idea was that the 11,000 or so residents of Tuvalu get longer-term visas to migrate to Australia, which sounds fantastic, Australia doing its part, and it was. But the part two of that was that Australia gets a veto over their relations with external security relations and defense relations with the external powers. So using climate change as a bargaining chip to achieve geostrategic goals is very much a hot topic in the Pacific and is being acted on. And this is neither good for peace, nor is it good for climate solutions, in my view.
So what the U.S. government is doing directly for climate change is one thing, and I'm not an expert in this area, but I can tell you that on the military side, they're clearly doing things to adjust. In the aftermath of Typhoon Mawar, which hit Guam in May of 2023, the effect on military bases, both Anderson Air Force Base, the communication station at the Naval Communication Station, which is part of the Navy base, and the Naval Base Guam itself, were both heavily impacted. So there was a quick assessment of what it would take to repair it. Now, I forget the exact numbers. I think it was $10 billion that Anderson wanted for rehabilitation, putting power lines underground, and it was like $5 or $6 billion for the naval station to do the similar types of things. And then that led to sort of an overall assessment of what would it take to sort of bring Guam up to a standard that was acceptable. Senator Weicker had a piece out last summer which said that the Joint Region Marianas had submitted a bill of like $60 billion to make adjustments. So the impact of things like typhoons are clearly dominant. The whole $60 billion figure is not just climate related, but a significant portion of it was. And to demonstrate the connection between federal work in Guam and the military, a principal road, the main road that circles the island, part of it passes near the area which supports the 6 submarines that are home ported in Guam. And that road connects the submarines to the ammunition annex. That road, in my lifetime, has been flooded more regularly than I remember it 30 years ago. It's flooded all the time. The place is called Polaris Point, just to make the point. Right now, it is a priority project of all federal funds in Guam. So the roads in Guam are not great, But the road that gets the priority is the one that's servicing the road to Polaris Point. So there's clearly an understanding that climate change matters to the military mission, and in Guam we can see that there's military action that is supporting that.
And I wanted to ask you, Laura, before we move on, about this the missile defense system. Now, everybody's heard by this point that Donald Trump wants to engage in building an Iron Dome for the entire continental United States. Can you give us a sense, and I know you said that a lot of these studies are hidden, so we don't know the capacity yet and the feasibility of this system, but do you get a sense that do you have any sense of whether or not you could extrapolate what you're seeing being built in Guam for that region further out to the continental United States? Is there any sense that this is sort of a first step in that direction, and any light you can shed on the thinking there?
Thanks. That's a really interesting notion or question, that Guam is the mini version of what the United States might eventually head towards. Well, I'm not sure that's quite. I think the idea of an Iron Dome over the continental United States is, I've been quoted as saying, is fantastical or a fantasy. It's challenging enough to do the simplest things, which we know, and trying to build a very complex, interrelated defense to a high standard of even a small area like Guam, much closer to adversaries than the United States' fortunate position, the continental United States' fortunate position is not facing currently short-range missiles from Canada or, anywhere nearby, Greenland. Right, so Guam does have a special, as pointy end of the spear, but you can see I think the mechanisms of sort of gung-ho, let's go try it all. Let's see if we can put it all together with a sort of technical exuberance and optimism, I think, in Guam, which I think is reflected in the idea of an Iron Dome, which, when you look at the executive order, includes many of the same things, including hypersonic missile defense, cruise missile defense, ballistic missile defense. So I think I appreciate the analogy.
So two things there. One, I think, Laura is very correct that all the things that are anticipated in the quote-unquote Iron Dome, and I don't think the president's talking about what's in Israel. I think he's got something much larger imagined. All the elements that he anticipates in that Iron Dome are part of the system that's being proposed to Guam. That system was advertised in the beginning, 4 years ago, as a prototype for a future homeland defense system. So this is not particularly novel. The second thing I want to add is just that yesterday, the Directorate of Office of Testing and Evaluation just released their fiscal year 24 report. And for the third year in a row, they have basically dinged the entire program that has been proposed. In fact, one of their notes, and this year they have a lot of references to Guam, for anyone that wants to dig into the weeds. One of the references is, you still haven't done what we said needed to be done in the FY23 report in terms of fixing things in the system. So there's clearly a lot of work to be done on the fantastical system that's being proposed in Guam.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and in Guam, in discussing this issue at home, we always try to make the point that the Iron Dome in Israel has a much more limited scope, and so stop calling it the Iron Dome, and it's not an Iron Dome for Guam. This is a much more complex endeavor. And then, lo and behold, now we get an Iron Dome for all of North America. It's a marketing slogan. That's right. And of course, added to the complexity of the Iron Dome over North America, they're going to have to figure out how it doesn't protect Canada and Mexico.
Okay, I'm going to decide whether I need to go in a Washington political direction or stay a little bit more with hard security. I think I'm going to go with the hard security because I wanted to ask, there have been a series of events and stories over the last few years about these specific islands being kind of squeezed between China and the United States. And there's the case of the Solomon Islands in China. Last year, the Solomon Islands elected Jeremiah Manele, who pledged to continue to take the nation into a pro-China direction, to the consternation of Australia in 2024. Tonga's prime minister said he would be open to accepting Chinese security support during their Pacific Island Summit back in August. This caused Antony Blinken, Secretary of State, to lash out. In his own visit to Tonga, he said, "I think one of the things that we've seen is that as China's engagement in the Indo-Pacific region has grown, there has been some, from our perspective, increasingly problematic behavior." In Papua New Guinea in 2023, PNG signed a defense pact that has been called the first major new access point for the United States military in years, and it allows the U.S. to station troops and vessels at 6 sites there for the first time. You know, that, of course, elicited a backlash from China. So it really sounds like these countries are being squeezed. On one hand, they welcome, you know, the money and resources and the relationships that these bilateral agreements bring. But on the other hand, there seems to be an implicit threat on the other side: don't get too close to the other guy. So could either or all of you kind of talk a little bit about how these island nations are navigating the shoals of the great power conflict, and is any of it actually helpful to them in the end, or what are they getting off from these trade-offs?
I think what you're seeing is an attempt to navigate those shoals. And so obviously there's going to be some back and forth and crossing, and sometimes Fiji went in one direction and then they reversed direction and went in the other way. But this is really, I believe, the end result of U.S. not paying attention for all these years, not paying attention to PIF, not paying attention till it's too late, not opening embassies, in fact, closing down embassies. And so that is really the consequence of this. But on the other hand, you have to recognize, I think, to recognize these as sovereign entities, even the entities that aren't fully sovereign, so that you can recognize them as independent actors. And, you know, I think an admiral in the UK recently stated, you know, don't be telling people, pick us or pick them. And if you force that choice, you're really not putting your best foot forward. And I think this is really the consequence of years of neglect and disinterest on the part of U.S. policymakers. And I would endeavor to say that this is a lesson for the behavior that is going on in the North Pacific. You know, pay attention to the nuances of it. Engage people at community levels. Don't assume that because you make an agreement or with a given political leader that you've resolved the issue for the foreseeable future, because these are complex matters. And you know, it took Pacific Island entities and communities and islands and peoples, took them generations to realize who they were and grasp their essence and be able to project their importance to the world. And we're seeing it manifest now. Now, of course, there's going to be some very, you know, things that cause me almost as much surprise as announcements coming out of Washington these days. So there's going to be some jumping around. But I think it's really the end product of the U.S. neglecting it all these years.
So, you know, the Pacific Islands do some of their own sloganeering, just to be honest. I mean, friends of all, enemies of none, friends of all is sort of a, you know, a Pacific way of expressing their openness. You know, and it has validity. The other thing is that it's not just, I mean, in this competition, I think some Pacific Islands are asserting their own agency. So, I mean, they're not obviously ignorant of what's going on, and where there's an advantage for them to play off the powers, I think you're seeing some of that. And you mentioned the Solomons, which I think is a great case, and I can anyone wants to talk about Solomons later, I'm happy to talk about it. I think today in the Solomons, there's both Chinese and Australian police training. Now, that doesn't get as much notice, but the Australians are working very hard at continuing their presence there. So both things are going on. And the Solomons do the diplomatic thing of entertaining it all. So I think it's a more complex issue. Whether the Solomons, the other thing is I think the Chinese, it doesn't take very much for them to make everybody jump in the region. So it doesn't take much Chinese money to get the Australians very excited about what they're doing in the Solomons. And in a way, imagine how much bandwidth that takes from Australia with very little effort on the part of the Chinese. So I think all these things need to be thought about and balanced in ways that recognize that the islands themselves have agency, but it does take commitment to be engaged in the process. Otherwise, you're not in the game.
Just make a quick comment, just adding a little bit to what I said earlier. I think the Pacific, and my colleagues here know far more about the Pacific than I do, but in general, the broad global South, the pattern is they actually don't mind a degree of competition between the US and China. They feel like as long as it is within bounds, and those bounds are significant bounds, and we are past those bounds, but as long as that's within certain bounds, they can leverage it. And many states, and Robert alluded to the dynamic nature. I think the dynamic nature of appearing to pick one side or the other when actually various things are going on, you can't even really define what's happening, is a classic pattern of smaller and weaker states. They are weak in certain respects, but in some ways they're more street smart than we are, and they have to be to survive. So the space for this kind of behavior is actually greater today than it was during the Cold War, quite substantially. One reason is because global South countries have become actually have more agency, have become richer relatively to the 60s or the 70s. And the others have learned to play the game better. So even smaller island states are doing it. In Africa, you're seeing countries like Niger and Burkina Faso, can't be called great powers. They can't even be called regional powers. Are able to assert themselves and define limits of great power behavior. Now, we can argue that this will not last or whatever. One can be very definitive about it. But I think that is not the case. I think what we are seeing is elements of new kinds of behavior that I don't think Washington and Beijing both understand and are limited by not understanding.
I think we should go to audience questions now. We have about 15 minutes left. So please raise your hand, introduce yourself, and let it fly. Anybody want to be first? I know you have burning questions. Okay.
My name is Ann Wright. I'm a retired Army colonel.
Wait for the microphone so we can get you on the video.
Okay. Yeah. My name's Ann Wright. I'm a retired Army colonel and a former U.S. diplomat. I was charge at Ponape, FSM, 25 years ago now. I now live in Hawaii, and I'm part of Hawaii Peace and Justice, and we're doing a lot of work on militarization of the Hawaiian Islands and the Pacific, and we'd be glad to work with the Institute. We also have what's called the Pacific Peace Network, which are peace organizations in countries all over the Pacific, and we certainly want to be a part of what you all are doing. Thank you.
Great.
Fantastic.
Thank you, Ann. And we've heard about you.
We've heard about you. Anybody else?
Hi, my name is Andrew Harding with the Heritage Foundation. I lead our works on the Pacific Islands. A question I have is, and I appreciate your perspectives today, given some of the points that you've raised and some of the changes you'd like to see, what would your recommendations be for either the executive branch or the legislative branch? What are some specific policy outcomes with the points that you've raised today that you would like to see in this Congress or within the next 2 to 4 years? Thanks.
Well, I certainly would like to see both the Resources Committee and the Foreign Affairs committees in Congress, take trips to the islands, and actually that's very important. Don't send your staff, go to these islands and see what's going on. And also in that process, of course, what will typically happen in that process is that they'll rely on actually a lot of people in the Pentagon and in the military to give them advice, which is okay, but you shouldn't rely on that exclusively. And that tends to be what happens in Congress. The executive branch, I'm not wired right now to give advice to the executive branch, except that, you know, really we worked on a little thing for the Compacts of Free Association for U.S. Institute of Peace, and we kept advising both the Congress and executive branch use more soft power. What about AID in Micronesia? And of course, that all is now kind of gone up in smoke. So, but the point is that you should use more soft power, because the soft power actually, and it should be used in a coordinated way, of course, with other forms of power. But that to me just seems really absurd. And I know that the compact states are, of course, far be it for me to. But I do know that the ambassadors and the ambassadors of the compact states and the compact states are very concerned about the compact arrangements that have already been made and whether they're going to be fulfilled, whether they're going to be, and so fulfill these arrangements. They were negotiated freely. It took great effort to get them funded. And to remember that if you don't treat these states fairly, then that is a lesson that is learned south of the equator. That the Pacific Island countries south of the equator are going to say, well, if this is how they treat their friends, imagine how they're going to treat other partners. So that's a really critical part of this. So the soft power, the attention to the compacts, the fulfillment of the compacts. Even a small thing like the privatization of the post office is really, because the freely associated states are dependent on the post office. I don't know what that means, and I don't know to what extent that creates consternation. It's not just mailing packages to your friends and your families. It's all about commerce. It's everything that's related to that, and those also were freely negotiated in the compact. So. That would be really important, and to kind of incorporate that lesson that how you treat the Micronesian freely associated states is a lesson writ large for the rest of the island Pacific.
So I have a very discrete piece, which is around the military activities. So there's some very known and well-documented impacts from military developments in Guam, and I'll use the example of housing. So the U.S. military currently provides overseas housing allowance, which is the most liberal housing allowance payment for its personnel that are in Guam. The military does not have enough housing in Guam for its personnel, and therefore the number of personnel that are getting the overseas housing allowance living off base is completely squeezing the Guam housing market. And there's a lot of dynamics about why there's no more supply in the housing market, which is also related to military activities, but that's a separate issue. I won't go into that. But there's thousands of houses that need to be built in Guam for the current military population, and there's going to be thousands more needed if the current plans go through. If those pressures are put on the housing market, there's not going to be enough housing anyway for everybody. It'll put more and more, it'll price more and more people out of the market completely in Guam. So if there's an unfunded priorities list at DOD, housing for Guam should be on that list. Because the impact on the outside the fence is tremendous.
And we should remind the Department of Defense that the new secretary in his hearing could only identify one military base, Guam.
We have you have the
Hey,
microphone.
yeah. David Vine from the Network to Dismantle the Military Industrial Complex and other cooperative groups. I really appreciate this. I really appreciate the focus on the effects on people in Guam, especially in other parts of the Pacific. I am concerned that, basically what all of you have described is incredibly irresponsible strategy that is building up U.S. military forces, bases, troops on Guam and throughout the region, and is leading us closer and closer to a war between the United States and China and their any allies. So it seems to me that talking about how we're going to get off the path toward war, how we're going to avoid what so easily could be a catastrophic war that could take tens of millions, if not literally billions of lives if it becomes a nuclear war, how we do that seems, and focus on the real problems facing us, it seems, I don't know, I'd love to hear thoughts about how we avoid war.
Well, yeah, obviously, I think we're all kind of committed to a peaceful solution and to find out what are the issues that are really causing this competition between China and the U.S. that affects all of us. Of course, the more military you build, the more you're, in a sense, tempting fate, because really you're encouraging your adversary to build a stronger military. So that's the end run of the missile defense system. A missile defense system encourages actually the other side to develop more missiles, more sophisticated missiles, to overwhelm your missile defense system. So that's a no-win situation. How we get people to comprehend that, I wish I knew the answer. I think constant discussion about it. I think, at the community level for us and at the island level, the islands always like to talk about the Pacific way. So, in a way, it's a slogan. It's just a slogan. They'll say, oh, we'll just get together and we'll have a consensus. But actually, there's a lot of power politics at work even in those conversations. But we like to say that we have a unique way of dealing with conflict. But that is at the nub of all of these issues. And I think the role of militarization in that process has to be understood. It's not fully, it's hard to make that case in a place like Guam, because in Guam, the militarization of the island is embedded in the whole structure and the whole system of the society. And, it's very easy to look around. There's 6 in our family, 4 of them joined them, and 3 of my brothers and my sister all went in the military. So it's all kind of part of who we see ourselves, and trying to get out of that, not to disparage military service, but just to get out of that, to understand that in its context, we're trying to figure out how to not make military life so necessary or so critical is really a major challenge. And if we could do that in Guam with your help, then you probably could do it in many, many other places. But it is a significant challenge.
I have a question back there.
Thank you. Thank you. My name is Sipiwe Kaba from South African Embassy. Chairperson, I'm trying to establish if we are framing the situation correctly by saying there is great power competition. Are we really experiencing great power competition, or are we experiencing contradictions, and even irreconcilable contradictions? I'll tell you this. The reason I'm asking this question is because of just the recent history tells us that we had great conflicts during the colonial era. And America has never supported decolonization. China, Soviet Union opposed colonization. And colonization in Africa, for example, and elsewhere in Asia, ultimately got defeated. And the world changed. Would we have said there was great power competition then? Or contradictions? And why do we insist and continue to define the current ongoing power struggle, which I'll refer to, as competition? Is that really a proper framing? Thanks.
I think it is. I think it is a very real competition between China and the U.S. and how that is framed in our day-to-day lives is what we're grappling with. Now, if you go back in history and you say, well, you know, the United States has never supported decolonization, which is an accurate statement. They will support it like, you know, sort of well, they did support it in some instances. Huh?
Indonesia.
In Indonesia.
You're in charter.
Yeah, there's that, you know, but the point is that I don't necessarily subscribe to the idea that the Soviet Union and China were in favor of decolonization as much as they were in favor of whatever position that was against the United States. And that in itself is an element of great power competition. So that doesn't really get us to the nub of it. I think that that certainly the nature of this competition is sort of overwhelming and not allowing us to imagine some different way of apprehending and interacting and creating a new world. That's true. That's true now.
I'll just add one comment on that. I agree with you, Robert. I mean, I exactly would have said almost the same thing. The only thing I would add is that when you go to, and I think this is also true for many Pacific countries, when you go to developing countries of the global South, they don't frame the world based on the competition, or at least they don't frame it exclusively on the competition. They frame it based on their rise and their interests. And some of that, they account for the competition because they see it. A few of them are a part of it because they're allies. But most of them are accounting for it because it's a systemic reality. But their interests are not, let's take part in this competition. Their interests are finding beneficial bilateral relationship with the United States in order to secure their interests. And we go to them talking only about the competition because that's on our minds all the time in Washington. That's what there's no oxygen here. It's just great power competition in the air. So what happens is we start talking past each other. Well, they want to talk about, that's fine, we'll talk about it, but let's talk about these other things. So one way to build better relations with countries, and including some of the Pacific sovereign states, is to actually widen our aperture beyond the great power competition a lot, not just a little bit, to get talking and to actually then build influence through that mechanism. Because when you actually are talking about mutual interests that are overlapping, then you can actually build American influence in a healthier, much healthier way. So.
Well, thank you very much. Are there any other questions? I don't want to keep anyone from asking. There's a lady right in the back there.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Eleanor Chiodi Hughes. I'm a non-resident fellow at a think tank called EconView. I know we're talking a lot about competition, but I think, you know, here in DC, that's what we often like to do when it comes to Pacific Islands, Southeast Asia, et cetera. As someone who's been to Pacific Islands a lot, I think there's a lot of perception and knowledge gaps about how Pacific Islands, I've mostly been to Melanesia and Polynesia, how they look at us and our staying power. I think of Solomon Islands, when they think of Americans, they might think about the competitive aspects with China, et cetera, but they also see, like, you know, American presence when it comes to like wartime legacies, and how, for example, our military through the Oceania Engagement Team is helping the RSIPF, the Royal Solomon Islands Police Force, you know, just get rid of the explosive ordinances and whatnot. So my question is, how can we make it so that the way in which Pacific Islands and the narratives, of course, across the different subregions are framed outside of the competitive aspects of, you know, what's going on, the great power competition, however you want to put it. And my second question, I know somebody mentioned something about scholarships, is I think that it'd be great if down the line there could be more young people who are just getting started in their careers going to Pacific Islands, especially Americans, because I think Pacific Islanders are doing a great job at that through certain programs that have started, for example, through the Biden administration. But how can we, I feel like we should make parallel efforts to do something similar. So love to hear thoughts on either.
Thank you.
Both. Thank you.
Well, I like the idea of students going to the islands rather than having the students come here, because when they come here, they don't go back. And that's a major problem for all Pacific Island societies. So I really like that idea. Well, the problem of engagement is always that if you want to use soft power, or you want to use different things, engage in programs that help people at community levels, and that's what you want to engage in. But if it always comes with the message that this has a price, and that price is you're going to have to pick somebody in the great competition, then it rings hollow. And so that's a very difficult thing to convey. But I really do believe that in the sincerity of people and the sincerity of effort. That's why I think the recent dispossession of AID is really harmful. It's so harmful to human relations, because that's when they say, well, they're doing all these things that are advancing human beings. Well, that's what they're supposed to be doing. You know, they're non-political. That's what they're supposed to be doing. They're supposed to be putting the best face of the United States forward. So I really like that idea of, especially of the students going there.
Just one thing real quick. Dr. Cooper and I have written about the framing of some of the interaction. So we were quite critical of the Biden administration's, what we called sort of a fossilized view of the U.S., which was reminding everybody about World War II. Like we're recovering these fields from the jungles we were at 80 years ago. That's the exact wrong framing when you're thinking about competition, because that reminds everyone of the war. And you're reminding everyone to pick sides in a war. I mean, that just didn't make sense. So I think there has to be a different framing for engagement rather than, our last good trip here.
Yeah, and that's so key. You know, I was at Indo-PACOM Command about maybe 2 or 3 years ago, and they were getting ready to go out, and they were going to the Solomons, and I said, please don't talk about the Battle of Guadalcanal one more time. I mean, it resonates for you because you think it was a good deal, but I don't think anybody there thinks of the Battle of Guadalcanal as a big deal, other than there's just a lot of rust and unexploded ordnance laying around. But it shows a certain blind spot. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. We've run out of time. But I want to pass the mic to our CEO, the Quincy Institute CEO, Laura Lumpy, for some final remarks, and then we have...
Not remarks, I promise.
Okay.
Sorry. Thank you. No, sorry. Well, we've gone a little bit long, so I just want to thank you, ambassadors in particular. I want to thank Robert, Laura, and Leland for joining us, and congratulate them in the endeavor, and Sarang for helping organize this, and Kelley for moderating. I hope you'll stay with us and talk with each other, talk with them, and celebrate the establishment of this center that I think is so important. While a think tank alone, as we know here at Quincy, is not enough, it's a start to create the analysis, the awareness, the effective communication, and to help build power, which I know you're all about. So we salute you. We look forward to working with you. We thank you for bringing the microscope, which we need so badly here in Washington, instead of the telescope, as you said. And so please join us, and Happy New Year to all of you. Please celebrate that with us as well. Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much.